The night is colder than usual. A thin mist slides across the cemetery like a living thing, clinging to headstones that lean with age. The iron gates groan as they move, as if warning anyone foolish enough to step inside. A lantern flickers in the distance, its flame bending under the weight of the wind. And beneath that dim light, something is moving. This isn't a ghost story. This is history. In the dead of night, graveyards across America became hunting grounds, not for monsters from fairy tales, but for men. Silent figures who carried shovels wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. Men who wore black coats, moved like shadows, and made their living off the dead. People in the 1800s whispered a single name for them: night doctors. For some, they were a rumor, a ghost story meant to scare children home before dark. But for others, especially in black communities across the American South, the night doctors were not legends. They were real. They prowled graveyards, crept through alleys, and stole the bodies of those who could no longer defend themselves. Imagine living in a time when death didn't guarantee rest, when even your grave was not yours to keep. Families buried their loved ones with fear in their hearts, not of the afterlife, but of the men who came after midnight. And every gust of wind outside their windows carried a question they could not escape. Will they come tonight? These whispers grew louder with every missing body, with every coffin left open, with every footprint found in the mud by morning. But what drove men to dig up the dead? Who were these night doctors? And why did medical schools, the very institutions sworn to heal, turn a blind eye to the most unsettling trade of the 19th century? Tonight, we step into that fog. We walk the path of the men who made a business out of the dead, and the communities who lived in fear of them. This is the story of the night doctors of the 1800s, a story of graveyards, greed, and the thin line between science and horror. The whispers of the night doctors didn't appear overnight. Their story was born out of something far colder and far more calculated. In the mid-1800s, America was changing. Cities were growing. Medical science was advancing, and universities were expanding their reach. A new age of modern medicine was rising, but with it came a hunger that could not be filled by textbooks alone. To train surgeons, physicians, and medical students, schools needed something very specific: human cadavers, real bodies to cut open, real organs to study, real people who once lived, now reduced to medical material. But there was a problem. There weren't enough bodies to go around. At the time, it was considered deeply disrespectful, even sinful, to dissect the dead. In many states, only the bodies of executed criminals could be used for dissection. But executions were rare, and medical colleges were multiplying. By the 1820s and 1830s, the demand for cadavers had far outstripped the legal supply. Medical professors faced a choice: stop teaching anatomy or look the other way as a black market quietly grew in the shadows. They chose the shadows. This was the birth of a hidden trade, one that began in the graveyards of cities like New York City, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and the American South. Men began sneaking into burial grounds after dark, digging up freshly buried bodies and selling them to medical schools under the table. But there was something far more sinister at play than just medical desperation. Hospitals and medical institutions in the South often targeted black communities. They believed no one would fight for these bodies. No one would investigate too deeply. And so, these communities became the prime hunting grounds of the night doctors. And soon, the rumors spread like wildfire. People spoke of white-coated figures who kidnapped the living and stole the dead. Children were warned to stay inside after dark. Families started burying their loved ones with bricks, iron cages, or armed guards nearby. What began as a quiet arrangement between doctors and grave robbers quickly became an open wound in the hearts of communities. The night doctors were no longer just criminals. They became a symbol of fear, of how even death couldn't protect the vulnerable. In this world, medicine and horror were no longer separate. They were partners, working hand in hand beneath the moonlight. And as this dark partnership grew, the men behind the shovels, the real body snatchers, began to appear. Shadows with names, lives, methods, secrets. And that's where our story digs even deeper. By the middle of the 19th century, American medicine was standing on the edge of a new era. Surgery was evolving. Anatomy was becoming essential. Medical students were no longer learning from drawings or wax models alone. They needed real human bodies to understand life and death. But in the quiet darkness, a grim truth emerged. Science was hungry, and the dead would feed it. In those days, there was no ethical donation system. The only legal cadavers came from executed criminals. But executions were limited, and medical schools were multiplying faster than the supply of bodies. In cities like Boston, New York City, and Baltimore, dozens of new students crowded into anatomy theaters with nothing to dissect. Medical professors faced a choice: stop teaching or find another way. And so the line between healing and horror began to blur. Doctors turned to graveyards, not out of madness, but out of ambition. They believed that understanding the human body was worth the cost, that the dead had no voice, that knowledge justified everything. And at night, when cities fell silent and fog swallowed the streets, the digging began. Fresh graves were the easiest targets. The soil was still soft, the coffin could be reached quickly. In just under 15 minutes, 2 skilled men could remove a body without leaving a trace. The bodies were delivered under cover of darkness, wheeled through alleyways, hidden in barrels, sacks, or crates labeled medical supplies. Doctors would nod quietly as they paid the snatchers in cash. No records, no questions, no names. This was not a single crime. It was an entire system built on silence. And yet, what made this trade truly monstrous was where it thrived the most: in poor and black communities. Wealthy families could afford to protect their graves with guards, iron cages, or stone vaults. But the graves of the poor, they were unguarded, forgotten, vulnerable.
Doctors and grave robbers learned this pattern well. They didn't need permission. They simply took what they needed. For many in these communities, the fear was not just superstition. It was lived reality. They buried loved ones and came back days later to find open holes, broken caskets, and empty graves. They knew who was behind it. They knew where the bodies were going, but they could do nothing. This was the true birth of the night doctors, not just as a myth, but as a mechanism of power, a machine that turned the poor into resources, a machine that turned the dead into currency. And with every body stolen, a new generation of doctors learned. Surgical skills grew, medical knowledge expanded, and in the shadows, the grave robbers grew bolder. What began as a quiet crime was turning into a thriving black market. And soon, it would involve men who lived by the shovel, men who made the grave their business. When the moon rose high over the cemeteries of 19th century America, ordinary people slept. But in the cold, wet darkness, another kind of worker began his shift. They called them resurrectionists, not because they brought people back from the dead, but because they pulled them out of the ground. These were the men who gave the night doctors their power. They weren't doctors or scholars, they weren't men in white coats. They were the shadows behind the science. Some were poor laborers desperate for money. Some were criminals running from the law. And some were medical students themselves, willing to dirty their hands to supply their own classrooms. Grave robbing was no glamorous work. It was filthy, dangerous, and often deadly, but it paid. For one fresh body, a skilled snatcher could earn the equivalent of several weeks' honest wages. And unlike other crimes, this one was oddly invisible. No screams, no alarms, just silence and dirt. They worked in pairs or small groups. One man to dig, one to keep watch. A lantern covered with thick cloth to dull the light. Boots wrapped in rags to muffle footsteps. Their tools were simple: shovels, hooks, canvas sacks. And their rules were strict: work fast, leave no trace, and never speak of it. These men learned to read graveyards like maps. They knew which graves were fresh, which belonged to the poor, and which corners were dark enough to dig without being seen. Some of these resurrectionists became infamous in their cities, ghost-like figures who haunted burial grounds for years. They knew every patrol schedule, every weak spot in cemetery fences, every guard's habit. But this was not without risk. Being caught could mean a public beating, imprisonment, or worse. Families sometimes waited in the shadows, armed, determined to protect their dead. And a few grave robbers never walked out of those cemeteries again. Many robbers didn't care who they dug up, but others were paid to target specific groups, mostly the poor and African Americans, because their graves were rarely defended. Some were even hired by medical schools themselves under the table. A few universities kept runners on their payroll, men who dug at night, delivered at dawn, and disappeared before anyone noticed. These weren't monsters from ghost stories. They were men driven by poverty, greed, and silence. Men who turned the act of desecrating a grave into a routine. Men who became invisible in history, yet held it in their hands. And as their trade grew, so did their precision. What began as a few desperate thieves turned into a network, an organized system that fed universities, fueled medical science, and terrified entire communities. The graveyard had become their workplace, the dead their inventory, and the darkness their greatest ally. But how exactly did they pull it off? How did they slip in and out of graveyards without a sound? That secret lay not just in their hands, but in their tools. The grave robbers of the 1800s didn't rely on brute strength alone. They relied on precision, on silence, on a set of simple, carefully chosen tools that turned the act of stealing a body into something coldly methodical. Every graveyard was a puzzle. Every grave a lock to be quietly picked. And these men were the locksmiths of the dead. First came the shovel, but not just any shovel. Their blades were wrapped in cloth to silence the metallic clang of earth meeting iron. Some even used wooden-handled spades with thin blades so the sound wouldn't carry in the still night air. One misstep, a loud scrape, a ringing sound, and they could alert patrols, dogs, or grieving families keeping vigil. Then came the lantern. It wasn't held high like in stories. The flame was dimmed and covered with thick, dark fabric, creating only a faint glow, just enough to see the soil, not enough to be seen from a distance. A grave robber's worst enemy was light. Once the location was chosen, they never dug the entire grave. That would take too long, too risky. Instead, they targeted just the head of the coffin, digging in a narrow oval shape. 2 men could do it in under 15 minutes if the soil was fresh. One would dig, the other would keep watch. Their ears were sharper than their shovels. When the coffin lid was reached, they used a hook or iron crowbar to pry it open just enough to slip ropes or straps around the body's chest or shoulders. The goal was simple: pull the body out, leave the coffin behind. And since clothing added weight and evidence, the corpse was often stripped right there in the grave. The canvas sack came next. Bodies were slid into these sacks like merchandise, tied shut, and hauled out with a quiet heave. In winter, when the ground was hard and the air cold, the bodies would stay preserved longer, making transport easier. In summer, time was their enemy. They had to move fast. For transport, they used wooden carts, covered wagons, or even barrels labeled medical supplies. Some wrapped bodies in straw or packed them in crates filled with sawdust to hide the smell. They avoided churchyards with heavy iron cages or stone vaults. Those belonged to the wealthy, protected against thieves. Instead, they targeted simple wooden coffins in poor neighborhoods. Soft earth, quick access, no guards. And when a patrol or villager came too close, they had tricks. Some threw blankets over the open hole to make it look untouched. Others lay flat in the grass, waiting for the danger to pass. A few carried forged papers claiming they were medical workers retrieving bodies legally. They were not just thieves. They were craftsmen of the night. Every move calculated, every sound accounted for. And the most unsettling part? Most of the time, no one ever knew. By morning, the grave looked almost undisturbed. A family would come to visit, see nothing out of place, and never realize the body beneath had vanished hours earlier. For these resurrectionists, grave robbing wasn't a one-time crime. It was a profession, a job, a nightly routine. And as their techniques improved, so did the network that bought their work, the underground market of the dead. Grave robbing may have begun with a shovel and a lantern, but it grew into something far more organized, something bigger, a business built on silence and the dead. By the mid-1800s, a shadow economy had taken root beneath the surface of America's growing cities. From Philadelphia to New York City, from Baltimore to Charleston, the stolen dead flowed like currency. Medical colleges and hospitals had a constant hunger for cadavers. Anatomy classes, surgical demonstrations, and research all required fresh bodies. Professors didn't ask too many questions. Students didn't dare. And the robbers knew exactly what they had to offer. A single corpse could be sold for the equivalent of $50 to $200 in today's money, sometimes more depending on its condition. Young, healthy bodies were prized. Bodies of executed criminals fetched the highest prices. But most of the supply came from those who had no defenders: the poor, the marginalized, the forgotten. Delivery was usually arranged under the cover of darkness. Wagons rolled into the back doors of medical schools at dawn.
A few professors or janitors would quietly receive the shipment. No receipts, no names, just cash and silence. Some resurrectionists became regular suppliers. They weren't just criminals anymore. They were businessmen in the shadows. They knew which institutions paid the fastest, which professors looked the other way, and which graveyards were safest to raid. In many cities, medical schools pretended they didn't know where the bodies came from. But behind closed doors, some went even further. They commissioned the thefts. They gave lists. They paid in advance. And in some cases, they even sent their own students to do the digging. Bodies didn't just stay local. In some cases, they were transported across state lines, in wagons or on trains, hidden in crates labeled specimens, medical equipment, or even furniture. Some smugglers disguised corpses as passengers, dressed them in coats, hats, and gloves to get them through checkpoints. And where there's money, there's competition. Gangs of resurrectionists sometimes fought over territories, claiming certain cemeteries as their own. A single graveyard could feed a medical school for months. But there was one more sinister layer to this black market. Black communities, especially in the American South, were seen as easy targets. Bodies from these graveyards were not just common, they were expected. And this normalized cruelty would go on to shape the terrifying legends of the night doctors for generations. The truth was simple and brutal. For many medical schools, the dead were not people. They were tools, objects. Their stories ended at the edge of a shovel. This network of robbers, smugglers, and medical men turned the grave into a marketplace. Every whisper, every coin, every wheel turning on cobblestone was part of a larger machine, a machine that grew too big to stop. But as the black market flourished, fear spread even faster. Communities began to fight back, and the legend of the night doctors grew its darkest roots in the hearts of those who were most vulnerable.
In the 1800s, fear walked freely through America's black communities. But not just the fear of chains or whips. It was something quieter, something that came after death. It was the fear of not being allowed to rest. Long after slavery ended, the shadow of exploitation remained. In cities like Baltimore, New Orleans, and Charleston, whispers spread through freedmen's neighborhoods. Whispers of men who came at night in white coats with wagons that never made a sound. They said the night doctors were coming. Some said they worked for hospitals. Others swore they were government agents collecting bodies for experiments. But everyone agreed on one thing: they hunted black bodies. These weren't just ghost stories. They were born from truth. Because while newspapers avoided the subject, everyone in those neighborhoods knew. Medical schools paid for bodies, and the poorest graves, often belonging to black men, women, and children, were the easiest to take. When a loved one died, the family would stay awake for days after the burial, guarding the grave. Mothers slept beside tombstones. Fathers carried shotguns through the cemetery at night. Some filled coffins with stones or buried the body twice, once shallow and once deep, to confuse the thieves. Yet even with every precaution, graves were found empty. Fresh soil overturned, coffin lids cracked, and always, there were no answers. That silence turned to terror. Terror turned to stories, and those stories became a legend. The night doctors became the boogeymen of the Black South. Not just thieves, but kidnappers. Parents warned children never to wander after sunset.
Nurses told tales of white-coated figures who rode through the streets with wagons full of stolen bodies. In some versions, they didn't even wait for death. They took the living. This fear wasn't superstition. It was a survival tool, a way for communities to protect themselves from real threats. And behind every myth was a grave freshly emptied. Doctors in some hospitals quietly dismissed these rumors as folklore, but deep down they knew the truth. The people were right to be afraid, because the very institutions meant to heal them were, in secret, violating their dead.
Over time, this collective terror became part of cultural memory. Even generations later, families spoke in whispers about hospitals that took people at night. For some, it was called night doctoring. For others, it was simply being taken. And while the rest of the country forgot the crimes of the resurrectionists, Black America remembered. Because to them, it wasn't history, it was inheritance. In the graveyards of the 19th century, the body could vanish, but in the minds of the living, the fear never died. Behind the tall brick walls of 19th century medical schools, another world existed, a world of whispers, shadows, and science, where the air was thick with the smell of formaldehyde and guilt. This was the realm of the dissecting rooms, where the stolen dead met the hungry hands of knowledge. By day, these schools were places of prestige, marble staircases, polished brass, professors in long coats. But by night, those same halls turned into theaters of secrecy. Students gathered behind locked doors, their faces pale under the yellow flame of gas lamps, their scalpels trembling over the bodies before them. The professors called it anatomical study, the students called it practice, but no one called it what it truly was: desecration. The bodies arrived at dawn, often still cold from the night air, wrapped in burlap, sometimes packed in sawdust or straw. Their arrival was greeted not with prayer, but with precision. Janitors or assistants carried them down narrow staircases to the basements, far from public view. Here, the dissecting room waited. Wooden tables stained dark from years of work, shelves lined with jars of preserved organs, cloudy glass filled with strange floating shapes, steel tools gleaming under candlelight, and in the corner, a small stove keeping the chill at bay. No one spoke much. Some students couldn't look directly at the faces of the dead. Others cut with enthusiasm, as if to prove they were not afraid. And in the silence, the only sounds were the scrape of scalpel against flesh and the slow turning of pages in anatomy books. Sometimes the professors would remind their students to show respect, but how could they when they knew where the bodies came from? Whispers passed between them, graveyards raided, families who found their loved ones missing. Everyone knew, but no one said a word. To question the source of a body was to risk your future. To refuse to participate was to risk your career. So they worked, cutting, studying, learning, and trying not to think of the lives behind the bodies.
In the South, many of those bodies belonged to black men and women. Hospitals and universities used their remains without permission, claiming it was for the advancement of science. To the students, it was anatomy. To the community outside, it was desecration disguised as education. Some doctors even gave names to the anonymous corpses, not out of compassion, but convenience. Subject 1. The male specimen, the Negroid cadaver. Cold, clinical words that stripped away humanity, one syllable at a time. As years passed, these dissecting rooms became symbols of both progress and horror. Within their walls, surgeons learned to save lives, But those lessons were bought with stolen bodies, with stories that never had an ending. Many of these rooms still exist today, hidden inside old medical buildings, now turned into museums or archives. Visitors speak of feeling uneasy, of smelling old chemicals, of hearing faint sounds when no one is there. Some say the spirits of the stolen linger still, not in vengeance, but in waiting, waiting to be remembered as more than subjects. Inside those dissecting rooms, medicine advanced by candlelight, but so did humanity's darkest compromises. By the late 1800s, the whispers of grave robbing could no longer stay buried. The business of death had grown too bold, too visible, too horrifying to ignore. And when the truth finally surfaced, it sent shockwaves through cities across America. Newspapers began printing stories of open graves, stolen bodies, and hospitals caught in the act. For the first time, the dark alliance between medicine and the midnight trade was dragged into the light. The most infamous case came from New York City in 1788, remembered as the Doctors' Riot. A young boy had seen a medical student waving a severed arm out of a school window, jokingly telling him it belonged to his recently buried mother. The boy ran home in terror. When his father went to the grave, it was empty. Within hours, the rumor spread like wildfire. Crowds stormed the medical college, breaking doors, smashing anatomy tables, and dragging doctors into the streets. By nightfall, the riot had consumed the city. More than 5,000 people took to the streets, hunting for grave robbers and night doctors. Several were killed before the militia restored order. But the message was clear. The people had had enough.
In Philadelphia, similar scandals followed. Students at medical schools were caught sneaking into graveyards, their pockets lined with surgical tools and rope. Each time, the schools claimed ignorance. Each time, the public grew angrier. Then came Baltimore. In the mid-1800s, Johns Hopkins and other hospitals quietly benefited from the same practice. Black graveyards in the city were repeatedly targeted, yet few cases ever made it to trial. Witnesses were silenced, evidence disappeared, and officials looked away. But one case that horrified the nation came from Cincinnati, Ohio. In 1878, a young woman named Augusta Davenport died and was buried in her family plot. Days later, her grave was found empty. Her parents searched for weeks before discovering her body inside the anatomy lab of the local medical college, dissected, tagged, and half preserved. The press erupted. Citizens flooded the streets demanding justice, but no one was convicted. The doctors denied involvement, claiming the body had been acquired legally. The outrage faded, but the memory didn't. And then there was the case of the Medical College of Georgia, one of the darkest of them all. For years, a man named Grandison Harris, known as the Resurrection Man, was employed by the school. His job was simple: dig up bodies, deliver them at night, and never speak a word. He was bought as a slave, and after gaining freedom, he kept working for the same college for decades. Students admired him, professors depended on him, but the community lived in fear of his name. It was not until the early 20th century that the full truth came out, that hundreds of bodies from black cemeteries had passed through his hands, all with the approval of those who claimed to teach healing. These cases were only the ones that made it to the papers. Thousands more were buried in silence. No investigations, no confessions, just missing graves and broken families. Yet each scandal added pressure. Public anger grew, laws began to change, and slowly society started to ask a haunting question. How far should science go in the name of progress? The answer would reshape medicine itself, but it would come too late for the countless souls already stolen from their resting places. The scandal of the night doctors wasn't just about bodies, it was about trust.
the moment people realized that the same institutions meant to heal them could also betray them. And in that betrayal, fear found a permanent home in American memory.
By the time the truth of the night doctors reached the public, it was too late to erase the fear. The damage had already been done, not just to the bodies but to the soul of every town touched by the trade. Cemeteries, once places of peace, became battlefields of the night. Families who once prayed over graves now guarded them with rifles. Fathers stayed awake until dawn, pacing between headstones, and mothers sat beside fresh graves with lanterns on their laps, whispering the same prayer over and over. Let them rest. Please let them rest. The fear spread faster than any rumor could be silenced. People began to see ghosts where there were none, a shadow in the mist, a shovel against stone, a flicker of light among the graves, and the cry would rise through the night doctors are here. Men grabbed torches and ran through the rain. Women rang the church bells to warn the village. Entire communities gathered, forming what became known as night patrols. Ordinary citizens turned into guards, protecting the dead as fiercely as the living. In some towns, watch houses were built beside cemeteries, small brick shelters where volunteers would take turns staying awake through the night. They watched for fresh mounds of earth disturbed, for footprints in the mud, for wagons parked too close to the gates. Other towns turned to invention. Blacksmiths crafted heavy iron cages that were placed over coffins, called mortisafes. They were locked tight and weighed hundreds of pounds, making it nearly impossible to remove the body without hours of work. Families who could afford these contraptions spent their savings on them, believing that only iron could keep the night doctors away. The poor who could not afford iron cages used their imagination. They buried thorn bushes over graves, set traps, or even poured lye and ash to make the soil harder to dig. Some placed broken glass beneath the surface, a last defense against the shovel's edge. Churches, too, joined the fight. Priests blessed burial grounds with holy water, reciting psalms over every grave. Some said the spirits themselves began to guard their own, that ghosts would whisper warnings when the night doctors came. And in the South, old superstitions mixed with faith. Graves were sprinkled with salt to confuse evil. Broken mirrors were buried with the body to trap wandering souls. But behind all the rituals and the steel, one truth remained. The fear was real. The threat was real. And the nights grew longer because of it. No one trusted the silence anymore. A passing wagon, a creak in the distance, a dog barking at nothing, it all meant danger. And yet, through this fear came resistance. Communities, especially black families, stood their ground. They protected their dead, they guarded their cemeteries, and they refused to let the night doctors win. Their courage transformed terror into defiance. And those night patrols became symbols of dignity, even in the darkest hours. But as time passed, governments could no longer ignore the uproar. The people demanded justice. They wanted laws to protect the dead. And for the first time, politicians began to ask a question no one dared before. Should science have the right to rob the grave? And with that question, the law began to change. By the end of the 1800s, the graveyards had become too loud with anger. The people had shouted, marched, rioted, and prayed, and finally, the lawmakers began to listen. The trade of the night doctors could no longer hide beneath the soil. The law itself was about to dig them out. For decades, politicians and doctors had danced around the same moral question. How could medicine advance without bodies to study? And how could the dead be protected if science refused to stop taking them? The answer came slowly, written in ink, not blood.
The first major change began overseas, in Britain, after a wave of public outrage. In 1832, Parliament passed the Anatomy Act, a law that allowed doctors and medical schools to legally use unclaimed bodies, mainly those who died in hospitals, prisons, or poorhouses. It was far from perfect, but it finally gave anatomy students a lawful way to study. And soon America followed. State by state, new laws appeared. In Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania, anatomy acts were introduced in the late 1800s, allowing medical schools to receive bodies of the unclaimed dead through official channels. Hospitals began keeping careful records. Police began patrolling cemeteries. The once silent transactions between doctors and grave robbers began to disappear, replaced by paperwork, stamps, and government seals. For the resurrectionists, it was the end of an era. Without protection from the shadows, many vanished, leaving no trace of their names in history. Those who had once made fortunes off the dead found themselves hunted by the living. But even as the laws changed, the wounds they left behind did not heal easily. The African American community, in particular, carried the scars of generations of stolen graves. Legal reform couldn't erase the fear. It couldn't return the bodies that had already been taken. In some cities, medical schools tried to repair their reputations. They held memorial services for the anonymous bodies that had been used for science. Plaques were raised, apologies written, though most came decades too late. But yet the world was changing. Medicine was growing more ethical. Donations of bodies, once unthinkable, began to be seen as acts of generosity. Slowly, humanity reclaimed the practice that had once belonged only to the dark. The night doctors had lost their trade, but their legacy lived on, not in the ground, but in every law book, every classroom, every whisper that reminded doctors of the line between curiosity and cruelty. The graves were finally safe, but the fear they created would live for generations. And though the law had won, the legend of the night doctors would not die, because legends are not buried by ink, they are carried by memory. And memory, like the night itself, never truly ends. The graveyards grew quiet. The shovels stopped. The wagons no longer rolled under moonlight. But the fear, that old familiar fear, never truly left. The night doctors were gone from the earth, yet alive in memory. In the decades after the laws changed, the practice of body snatching faded, but the stories did not. They slipped into folklore, whispered from generation to generation. For many in the American South, the night doctors became something more than grave robbers. They became symbols of betrayal and survival. Parents told their children to come home before dark, warning that the night doctors still roamed, looking for bodies to take. Nurses in hospitals told patients never to fall asleep near certain wards because that's where they come for you. And for many African Americans, especially in rural communities, the fear of hospitals became real, rooted in history, disguised as superstition. But beneath the superstition lay truth, because even after grave robbing ended, exploitation did not. From unethical experiments to medical neglect, the line between myth and reality blurred again and again.
The story of the night doctors became a shield, a way for families to protect one another, to teach caution in a world that had so often treated their bodies as expendable. Folklorists in the early 1900s began collecting these stories. In Georgia, people spoke of night riders, doctors who kidnapped the living for blood experiments. In Tennessee, tales told of boogie doctors who would come in white coats to take you away if you disobeyed your parents. And in Florida, the phrase, "Don't let the night doctor catch you," became a warning every child understood. For outsiders, these were just ghost stories, but for those who carried the memory, they were lessons written in pain, because their grandparents had seen what happened when the night doctors came, and their graves, once empty, had taught them that safety could never be taken for granted.
Over time, historians began to study these legends, tracing them back to the body-snatching trade, to hospitals that preyed on the poor, and to universities that buried their shame beneath marble walls. And with every uncovered document, every confession, every unearthed truth, the line between legend and fact blurred even more. Today, the night doctors live not in cemeteries, but in cautionary tales. Their story reminds us of what happens when science forgets its humanity, when power hides behind progress. They became, in a way, the conscience of history, a ghost that refuses to be silenced until the world remembers what it did in the dark. The night doctors are long gone, but their legend still breathes, in stories told under the porch light, in the hesitance that still lingers around hospitals, and in the unspoken truth passed down like a warning. The night doctors took our dead ones. We'll never let them take us again. The story of the night doctors is not just a story of graves and shadows. It is a story of trust betrayed, of science without soul, and of the people who learned to fear the very hands that promised to heal them. When the digging stopped, the silence that followed was not peace, it was grief. For the bodies taken, for the names erased, for the families who sat beside empty earth, whispering apologies to ghosts that would never answer. Today, their graves lie still beneath the same soil that once betrayed them. The weeds have grown over, the fences have rusted, the lanterns are gone, but the memory remains, heavy, invisible, alive in every story that refuses to be forgotten. Historians call it resurrectionism. Doctors call it anatomical necessity. But to the people who lived through it, it was violation of the dead and of the living. And that violation left a mark deeper than any shovel could dig.
Even now, more than a century later, the legend of the night doctors lingers in the corners of America's collective memory. It echoes in the fear of hospitals, in the distrust of institutions, in the quiet question that still haunts many. Do they see us as human or as subjects? The night doctors taught the world a lesson it never meant to learn, that progress built on the suffering of the powerless will always leave a scar, that truth buried in darkness always finds its way to the light, and that the dead, no matter how long forgotten, will always have a voice, if we are willing to listen. In their own grim way, the night doctors gave birth to something new: accountability, modern ethics in medicine, consent, respect for the body after death. These values did not come from comfort. They were carved from horror. Every law, every oath, every code of ethics was written because someone, long ago, broke them in the dark. So tonight, as you listen to this story, imagine those silent cemeteries. Imagine the men who dug, the doctors who bought,
and the families who never stopped waiting for justice. Because in that waiting, in that endurance, lies the most powerful thing the night doctors never expected to leave behind: strength. The graves may have been robbed, but dignity, once reclaimed, cannot be taken again. And so, beneath the quiet earth, the forgotten rest, not in fear, but in peace.